The Far East. Fishes, asking what water was, went to a wise fish. He told them that it was all around them, and yet they still thought that they were thirsty. Nasafi. The influence of Sufism upon Indian mystical life has been so great that several schools which had been considered to be the product of ancient Hinduism are revealed by scholars to have originated in Sufi teachings. This historical fact is of less importance to the Sufi than the fact that the mystical stream, its source, is essentially one. The different outward aspects of mysticism in the Far East have generally caused it to be assumed that the cults are independent products of the culture in which they are rooted. But such a view of life is impossible to those who believe that there is only one truth, and that those who know it must communicate and cannot remain in compartments. Over 1,000 years ago, the seed which was to bloom into a variety of meditative schools of apparently Hindu origin was planted in India. The love mysticism of the Bhakti type is one example, here noted by Dr. Tara Chand in the Cultural History of India. Certain other characteristics of South Indian thought from the 9th century onward, however, strongly point to Islamic influence. They are the increasing emphasis on monotheism, emotional worship, self-surrender, papati, and adoration of the teacher, Guru Bhakti. And in addition to them, laxity in the rigours of the caste system and indifference to mere ritual, absorption in God through devotion to a teacher. The Sufi conception of the deified teacher was incorporated into medieval Hinduism. Dr. Chand, great scholar though he is, fails to note here that the significant points which he lists are, in their grouping and emphasis, Sufic rather than directly Islamic in the usual sense, in the sense in which they are understood by the Muslim clergy. In most Indian cults, the role of the deified teacher has been perverted from its originally Sufi nature and has undergone a transformation which has given later Hindu schools a non-Sufi emphasis. All too often, these are the cults which fascinate Western students, anxious to find spirituality in action in the East, who tend to be reduced to attachment to mere derivatives of Sufi schools, which use the trappings of Hinduism. Although they undoubtedly had something to build upon, it was the Sufi teachers who were responsible in great measure for the establishing of what became known as great Hindu schools of mysticism. Auguste Barth notes in his Religions of India the correspondence between the geographical and chronological settlement of Sufis in India and the rise of what were later thought to be Indian mystical schools of great antiquity. It is precisely in these parts that, from the 9th to the 12th century, those great religious movements took their rise which are connected with the names of Sankara, Ramanuja, Anandatirtha and Basava, out of which the majority of the historical sects came, and to which Hinduism presents nothing analogous until a much later period. Vedanta is a revival based upon the ancient Hindu scriptures interpreted over 1,000 years after their composition by Sankara, 788 to 820. This system, Vedanta means completion of the Vedas, covers the ground introduced by Ghazali, Ibn al-Arabi and Rumi following the Sufi ancients. The resemblance of Kant's work to Vedanta is attributable to the Sufi philosophical stream. See the absolution of Sankarya as compared with Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi's school of thought by the Turkish scholar Rassi Guven in Prajna, Part 1, 1958, pages 93 to 100. One factor has prevented students from being able to check the claims to great antiquity made for the mystical movements among the Hindus. This was, strange though it may seem to most readers, The fact that the early Hindu religious literature was written down only in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, at the instance of such British scholars as Sir William Jones. Professor S. Pigott, Prehistoric India, London, 1961, page 235. Ancient documents scarcely exist. The oldest Indian manuscript is thought to be a Buddhist fragment on birch bark of the late 5th century AD from Taxila. The Bakhshali manuscript of the same material seems the next claimant for high antiquity, though this is only of the 12th century. Prehistoric India, page 252. The Bhakti and reformist movements in Hinduism, which produced such great names as Madhva, Ramananda, and Kabir, are based to a great extent upon Sufi thought and practice, introduced into India after the Islamic conquest. Kabir spent considerable time with Muslim Sufis. Dadu manifests perhaps even greater knowledge of Sufism than his predecessors, perhaps because the Sufis of Western India wielded greater influence upon the minds of the seekers after God, Hindu or Muslim, than those of the East, says Tara Chand, who is not himself a Sufi. The Sikh religion, it is a matter of historical fact, was founded by the Sufized Hindu Guru Nanak, who freely admitted his debt to Sufism. Of him, the cultural history says, "Manifestly he was steeped in Sufi lore, and the fact of the matter is that it is far harder to find how exactly he drew from the Hindu scriptures. His rare references to them lead one to imagine that Nanak was only superficially acquainted with the Vedic and Puranic literature." The name Sikh means seeker, the style used for the Sufi traveller. Maharshi Devendranath Tagore, 1817 to 1905, the father of Rabindranath Tagore, spent 2 years in the Himalayas. During this time he was not studying the scriptures of his Hindu patrimony, but a poem from the Sufi master Hafiz, as a consequence of which he was rewarded with a beatific vision, according to another Hindu savant, Professor Humanantha Rao. The later Sufi teachers in India, many of whom followed the Turkish, Afghan, and Persian conquerors, had an effect upon the country which is second to none. One of the consequences of their arrival was that the Hindus actually adopted the Arabic word for a dedicated Sufi, fakir, and applied it to themselves. Whole books have been filled with the amazing deeds and miracles attributed to these men, and even today millions of people of every persuasion gather to worship or invoke their aid as saints. Muinuddin Chishti, the founder of the Chishti order in India, was sent to Ajmer in the middle of the 12th century to bring his teaching to the Hindus. The Raja Prithvi Raj, who resented his arrival, is reputed to have assembled soldiers and magicians to stop him entering the city. The soldiers were struck blind when the saint, following a precedent of the Prophet, threw a handful of pebbles toward them. One glance from the eyes of Muinuddin, we are told, and 300 yogis and pandits were unable to open their mouths and became his disciples. But by far the most impressive tale is that of the supernatural combat between the famous Hindu magician Jaipal Yogi and the Sufi fakir. Jaipal brought with him some thousands of his yogi disciples, according to Chishti legend, and cut off the water supply to Lake Anasagar. One of the Chishti's new converts, under Muinuddin's orders, took 1 bucketful of water out of the lake, whereupon every stream and well in the area became dry. Jaipal sent hundreds of apparitions, including lions and tigers, to attack the saint and his following. They were all destroyed as soon as they touched the magic circle which Muinuddin had drawn for protection. After a number of similar feats, Jaipal surrendered and became one of the Chishti's most famous disciples, known as Abdullah of the Wilderness, because he is supposed to wander eternally in the vicinity of the great shrine at Ajmer. There are, quite perceptibly, 3 levels of contact between the Sufis and the Hindu or Sikh mystics. A misunderstanding of this has been responsible for much confusion. In the historical and cultural context, as well as in the truly metaphysical one, all parties share a sense of unity of aims in the role of mysticism to develop man. They are also at one in their essential harmony. It is in the field of rigid and repetitious ritual, fossil dogma, and personality veneration that there are very considerable rifts. The narrow, morbidly formalist Muslim who is following a superficial Sufic way will clash almost invariably with his opposite number, the professional Hindu ascetic wedded to a deteriorated tradition. Since it is these last who make the most noise and show, it is they who are taken, all too often, by outsiders as genuine representatives of the mystical stream of India. Their studied asceticism and worldly endowments are almost always far more striking and attention-compelling than the schools of the real mystics. They also tend to burst into print, to provide material for documentary photographers, to recruit disciples from abroad, to try to spread their teaching as widely as possible. Many of the Eastern-based cults of the Western world are in fact nothing more than derivations of these menageries, which have assumed the traditions and superficial colour of the authentic tradition. They tend not to accord with the advice of the great teacher Sheikh Abdullah Ansari, felicitously translated by a distinguished Sikh, the Sardar Sir Jogendra Singh. Fasting is only the saving of bread. Formal prayer is for old men and women. Pilgrimage is a worldly pleasure. Conquer the heart. Its mastery is conquest indeed. The Sufi law of life requires kindness to the young, generosity to the poor, good counsel to friends, forbearance with enemies, indifference to fools, respect to the learned. There is an interesting interaction between Hindu thought and Sufi teaching, an example of which is contained in the commentary on the slokas. A great deal of Hindu popular wisdom is contained in a series of sayings called slokas, passed on from a teacher to his disciple. Sufi commentary, such as that of Ajami, holds that the slokas as generally circulated are one half of a double system of instruction. Like the fables of Aesop or the tales of Sadi, they may be read either as merely good advice upon which one could rear one's children, or for their inner meaning. Here are some of the slokas, together with Ajami's comment, which is used as an exercise by Indian Sufis. These slokas have been numbered in accordance with Abbé Dubois' great work, Hindu Manners, Customs and Ceremonies, Oxford 1906, pages 474 and following. Sloka 5. In the afflictions, misfortunes, and tribulations of life, only he who actively helps us is our friend. Comment. Study whether you know what help is. Enlightenment is necessary before the wild one knows it. Sloka 11. The venom of a scorpion is found in its tail, that of a fly in its head, that of a serpent in its fangs. But the venom of a wicked man is to be found in all parts of his body. Comment. Meditate upon the good of a good man, equally well distributed. Sloka 18. The virtuous man may be compared to a large leafy tree which, while it is itself exposed to the heat of the sun, gives coolness to others by covering them with its shade. Comment. The virtue of a good man will assist the sincere, but will weaken the indolent. shelter is only a respite from work. Sloka 41. A shameless man fears the maladies engendered by luxury. A man of honour fears contempt. A rich person fears the rapacity of kings. Gentleness fears violence. Beauty fears old age. The penitent fears the influence of the senses. The body fears Yama, the god of death. But the miser and the envious fear nothing. Comment: Be a wise man, for he understands the nature of fear. It is therefore his slave. There had been 1,000 years interchange between the Sufis and Hindu mystics before any Western scholar interested himself in Indian mysticism. In the 17th century, Prince Dara Shikoh of the Mughal line carried out a thorough assessment of Vedic literature and a comparison between Islamic and Hindu modes of thought. Like the Sufi teachers before him, he came to the conclusion that Hindu scriptures were the remnant of an esoteric tradition identical with that of Islam, and in its most inner sense, precisely the same as the Sufi one. His researches included also the sacred books of the Jews and Christians, studied from the point of view that they might represent the exteriorization of an inevitable development of human consciousness concentrated from time to time in certain population groups. It is upon the basis of his work, which itself follows the attitude of the scholars of Harun al-Rashid of Baghdad, that a great deal of subsequent, even quite modern, mystical comparison rests. The work of Dara Shikoh, striking because carried on by a Muslim prince of a family ruling a land of unbelievers, is only one expression of the contact carried on by Sufis throughout India for centuries. In this respect, the process can be seen as closely approaching that which took place in medieval Europe, when the existence of a strong and authoritarian church did not prevent the development of groups such as those Sufi organized ones which we have unearthed in previous chapters. The role of Sufism, however, should not be considered to be one of projecting the results of comparative religious study and stressing the theosophical theory of the essential unity of religious manifestations. There has never been a time when the Sufis did not regard themselves as being involved in a task, the task of transcending outward forms and making common cause with the religious fact, the acquisition of knowledge about religion by means of itself. While it might be difficult to explain in the cruder terms of accepted formal religion that there was a unity in experience, that unity was nevertheless there all the time. The nearest that one can get in familiar terminology to this fact is to say that for the Sufi and other mystics of the Sufic stream, this was a psychological study, not an academic one. The object of the study, again using the limited phraseology available to us here, was to make oneself available to the inner motivation which was trying to produce a further development in human consciousness. Mysticism and religion, therefore, are looked upon as the yoking of the individual and the group with the destiny of mankind as expressed in a mental urge. A resemblance between Sufi thought and practice and the strange, allegedly typical Buddhistic cult of Zen as practiced in Japan is of great interest. Zen claims to be a secret transmission outside of the canonical Buddhist field, passed on by individual example and teaching. Historically, it is of no great age, and it is not connected even by its practitioners with any special event in the life of Buddha. Its earliest records date from the 11th century, while the earliest school to be founded in Japan was brought from China in 1191. The period during which Zen was imported into Japan corresponds with the modern growth of Indian schools under Sufi impetus. Its place of origin, South China, is a location where there were settlements of Arabs and other Muslims for centuries. Buddhism itself in Japan only dates from the year 625 and mainly came into the islands between the second half of the 7th century and the beginning of the 9th century. Muslim and Sufi penetration and conquest of the traditional Buddhist shrines of Central Asia was well underway by then. It was from the great Buddhist strongholds of Afghanistan that the Buddha cult entered Tibet after the Muslim conquest. There are legends connecting Chinese Zen with India, and Sufi tradition asserts that the early classical Sufis made spiritual contact with the followers of Bodh, just as they had found a common denominator with the mystics of the Hindus. The similarities between Zen and Sufism, both in terminology, stories, and activities of masters, are considerable. From the Sufi viewpoint, the practice of Zen as given in popular literature resembles irresistibly the working of a part of the technique of the impact, Zab, of Sufism. Dr. Suzuki, the foremost literary Zen exponent, would seem to be right in considering Zen adapted to the Far Eastern mind, but ideas, allegories, and examples contained in Sufi teaching were well established centuries before the Zen teacher Yengo, circa 1566 to 1642, wrote the letter quoted in answer to What is Zen? Those who have read the foregoing chapters of this book will be well familiar with such phraseology as this, if allowance is made for a Far Eastern staccato turn of speech. It is presented right to your face, and at this moment the whole thing is handed over to you. For an intelligent fellow, one word should suffice to convince him of the truth of it, but even then error has crept in. Much more so when it is committed to paper and ink, or given up to wordy demonstration or to logical quibble, then it slips further away from you. The great truth of Zen is possessed by everybody. Look into your own being and seek it not through others. Your own mind is above all forms. It is free and quiet and sufficient. It eternally stamps itself in your 6 senses and 4 elements. In its light all is absorbed. Hush the dualism of subject and object. Forget both. Transcend the intellect. Sever yourself from understanding, and directly penetrate deep into the identity of the Buddha mind. Outside of this, there are no realities. Suzuki, An Introduction to Zen Buddhism, London, 1959, page 46. It would be easy to attempt to build upon these striking facts a case for the transmission of Sufism and the ultimate derivation of what is now called Zen from that source. But according to Sufi belief, the basis must always have been there, working in the human mind. Any Sufic contact would merely have helped to rekindle the inner consciousness of the only true reality. A Chinese Sufi, Mr. H. L. Ma, speaking at a meeting of the Hong Kong Metaphysical Association a decade ago, shows how the way of putting ideas can seem to vary with the cultural environment. With respect to all the seekers of truth, I must say that Sufi is hard to impart. Why? Because new hearers expect the unfolding of a system to follow their accepted pattern of thought. They do not know that this pattern is what is wrong with them. Sufi is in you already. You feel it, but you do not know what it is. When you feel certain feelings of kindness, love, truth, wanting to do something with all of you, that is Sufi. You think of yourself first. That is not Sufi. You have a strong sympathy for a worthy sage. That is Sufi. A master, asked what Sufi is, hits the questioner. He means by this, show me the pain and I will show you Sufi. You say to master, Where did the light come from? He blows it out. He means, you tell me where it is gone, and I will tell you where it came from. You cannot tell in words what you ask in words. This may sound extremely oriental to the Western reader, but the illustrations used, the pain and the candle, are not Far Eastern analogies at all. They come directly from the teachings of the Western master Rumi. The method of presentation of the ideas, rapid and parabolic, however, seem very Chinese, yet they retain the spirit of the Sufi. It is Colonel Clark's way of putting his impressions of the Sufis, however, which gives the more Western mind a chance to grasp what the orientation of the schools is, and produces an atmosphere which is necessary to the Western mind. The sublime love poetry of the Sufi saints, the wholly practical nature of their teachings, the fervour allied with a deeply underlying sense of mission, of attainment of needs both spiritual and physical, the confidence of the message and the future of the human race, these are some of the outstanding contributions of this wonderful body, admission to whose numbers conveys the undoubted and abiding sense of membership of an ancient elect. Colonel A. Clark, Letters to England, Calcutta, 1911, page 149.